Welcome to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. Today's guest is Bob Snow. He's a retired homicide detective who's written several books on police work, as well as Looking for Carroll Beckwith, Portrait of a Past Life Skeptic. This documents his past lives he discovered during a past life regression. Today, we'll be talking about his story. Bob, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me on your show.
Prior to this experience, what were your beliefs in the afterlife, past lives, and for that matter, reincarnation?
Before I undertook this, I thought that was just a bunch of hooey. I thought it was people who were trying to blame their misfortunes in this life on something else, or saying, gee, I know this life's a mess, but it's because of a past life type thing. I really thought just goofy people were trying to find some reason for messing up this life. I didn't believe there was any validity to it at all.
Interesting. Many of us, myself included, kind of thought the same thing. It does seem very fantastical, something you'd read in a work of fiction, that is. So,
yeah, exactly.
Okay, you are a writer, and you've been writing, I believe, about 20 or so books on police work.
Yeah, I have 20 books in print. All of them, except for my book about Beckwith, are about police procedure, about SWAT teams, a sex crime investigation, homicide investigation, how to protect yourself from crime, these kind of things. You write what you know, and I was a policeman for 38 years, so I know a lot about police work. What's interesting, I never wanted to be a policeman. When I was growing up, never thought about that. But I was in the military during the Vietnam War, and when I did my time, I was discharged. I came home from service, and I needed a job. Police work was a good job with lots of excitement and good pay and good benefits, but it also gave me just mountains of information to write about. I had over 100 articles and short stories published before I started writing books. To be a writer, you just can't write. You have to be a very voracious reader, too. I belonged to a number of book clubs, and one time was a book called Coming Back by Dr. Raymond Moody. Dr. Moody had recently done research on near-death experiences. He had a friend who was a psychologist who did past life regression therapy, and she wanted him to undergo it. So he allowed her to hypnotize him, and I guess he went to 8 past lives. In the book, at the very end, he kind of hedges and said, I don't know what this was. I'm not really sure if this was true or not. That's kind of the way I felt. It's nice, but it's all imagination. It's not true.
That's a good point. You brought up Raymond Moody, who is an authority in that area. Now, you read this before you had your experience, right?
This is kind of what led to it. A few months later, after reading the book, I was at a party. My wife was also a police detective, and I went with her. And there was a lady there, Kathy Graben. Well, Kathy was a child abuse detective, but she was also a practicing psychologist. And I didn't know at this time that Kathy used past life regression therapy in her practice. She asked me what I thought about it, and I told her I thought it was just a bunch of goofy people making up stories to please the hypnotist and all. And I'd been late in the party, and I had a bit to drink, and I was kind of obnoxious. I was making fun of past life and everything. She basically said, well, if you think it's stupid, why don't you try it and tell me it's stupid? I said, no, I'm not doing that. But then I got to the point, oh, you're scared. Anyway, I finally said, okay, I will. I'll try it. So she gave me a card of a friend of hers, a Dr. Mary Ellen Griffith, who did past life regressions. Go see her, have it done, and tell me how goofy you think it is. The next morning, this is stupid. I'm not going to go that. But they seemed like from then on, I'd run to Kathy all the time. It seemed like almost every day I'd see her. And she'd ask me, well, have you made your appointment with Dr. Griffith yet? And I'd make some kind of flimsy excuse about, I had 3 meetings and reports and I couldn't do it. But it seemed like I'd just run to her every time. I'd walk down the hall. There she is again. Well, I'd want to hide to get away from her. So finally, I got tired of this. I thought, this is silly. So I called Dr. Griffith and I made an appointment. My plan was I was going to go see Dr. Griffith. I was going to cooperate 100%. And I was going to show Kathy how goofy this was. I was going to bring my own tape recorder along, tape the session, and I was going to prove to Kathy that they past lives and all this are just hooey. It was just weak people making up stories to please the psychologist. So anyway, when the day came, I came to see Dr. Griffith, very nice lady. So I sat down on the couch, and she asked me, well, have you got some problems? No, I just think past life regression is interesting. I want to try it. I had my own tape recorder turned on. I was going to record everything to show how stupid this all was.
I'm sure that recording is going to have some discovery, which I'm sure we're going to get to.
We just sat and talked for a bit. She asked me about my college graduation. Then she went to high school and grade school, then kindergarten. She wouldn't have been a very good interrogator because I could anticipate her next question. But she kept going and going. So finally she said, okay, you're ready to start. I said, okie dokie. So I turned her tape recorder on. And she says, now close your eyes. Can you see a balloon? Imagine you can see a balloon. Now I could see a purple blob on my eyelids. I knew it was just the light coming from the window. Yeah, I see a purple balloon. And she said, okay, now imagine you get in the balloon and you go up. So I'm trying to imagine this with her. And she said, okay, now I want you to fly away. I'm trying to imagine this and everything. At the bottom of my eyelids, I could see little points of light. But I assumed that was just glare off the floor. I didn't think it was anything important. She finally said, okay, now I want you to look up above you. There's a handle to pull. We're going to take the balloon down somewhere. So we went through this probably a dozen times, and nothing happened. I thought, I'm not going to say something just to please her or make up anything. So finally she said, okay, obviously there's places you don't want to stop. Now, see if you can imagine for me, imagine a mountain. So I tried to imagine in my mind a mountain. She said, okay, now take the balloon to the mountain. She said, now look, there's a log cabin here. I tried to imagine seeing a log cabin. And I did. But funny thing, in my imagination, when I said a log cabin, the logs are going vertical rather than horizontal. And one of my readers later wrote me and told me that's the way the French built their log cabins. So anyway, she said, okay, now go into the log cabin. What do you see? Well, I didn't see anything. Again, this is her daydream. I didn't see anything. So she said, well, imagine a meal, and it's all bright and cheery. Okay, I went through all this, tried to imagine things with her. So finally she said, okay, now we're going to leave the cabin. We're going to walk down into the valley. There's going to be 12 steps. So she starts counting, says 12 and 11, and the numbers get longer, 10, 9. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, this is really stupid. Jesus, what am I doing here? When she got down to 1, something bizarre happened, something really bizarre. All of a sudden, I was in a valley. Now, I wasn't just imagining I was in a valley or daydreaming it. I was in a valley. Now, I knew I was still sitting in her office. I could still feel the couch. I could hear noises outside the window. But at the same moment, I was in a valley. I was walking along like a little brook, and there was a bush next to me. I could see the veins and the leaves on the bush. I'm not stupid. I knew what happened. I knew I had been hypnotized. It was really kind of neat. Everything was just crystal clear. It was as clear as any experience. I could see the veins on leaves.
This is the first time you've been hypnotized. You were never hypnotized before.
Yeah, first time ever. But I could also feel a breeze in my face. There's a breeze blowing because the leaves are moving. But I just wrote that off to the air conditioner in the office and all this. So as I'm walking along, she said, okay. She said, look down, describe yourself. So I look down, and I see a pair of dirty, hairy legs and gnarled-looking feet wearing some really dirty, matted fur. In my left hand, I have a large piece of a tree limb. Dr. Griffin had told me before this, she wanted me to go back to my very first past life. I knew what this was. Everybody's seen movies and TV programs what a caveman looks like. I thought, boy, this is just goofy. I thought it was kind of fun, too. You can go to amusement park, Disney World, and they have virtual reality rides that are really realistic. But, they're not real. And that's all I thought this was. This is really realistic, but it's not real. It's just my imagination. But all of a sudden, the person whose body I was in, I could sense what they were thinking. And I realized that I belonged here, that I lived in this valley. I told Dr. Griffith, I live in a cave up on the hill. And then I started saying things that I didn't know I was going to say. I just started blurting things out. And I realized it wasn't me speaking. It was the body, the person speaking in. Because I realized this is my home. She said, okay, go to your home and tell me what you see. There's a cave. Whoever lived here was not a very hygienic person. I walked in, there was this terrible stench in the cave. And I couldn't imagine where would that come from. I just smelled this awful smell. So anyway, I went through describing the cave to Dr. Griffith. And she said, okay, now once you go to your death, tell me what you see. Well, all of a sudden there was maybe, 4 or 5 seconds, kind of like gray fog. You didn't see anything. And all of a sudden it clears and I'm not in the body any longer. I'm floating above. And I'm looking down, there's a skinny little guy laying on the cave floor in furs, and he's just coughing and hacking and shivering. And I realized that's me and I'm dying. Dr. Griffith said, okay. He said, now go out of the cave and look up into the sky to see if you see a light. And sure enough, there was a light. And she said, okay, what did you learn from this life? And I said, I learned what it was like to be alone. I didn't have anyone at all in this life. I was alone my whole life. She said, I want you to go into light. I want you to go into a life where you did have someone, where you had someone important to you. This is like the coolest amusement park ride I've ever been on. It was kind of like an LSD trip without the drugs, without the danger. It was that vivid and that clear. So I went to the light. He going to give me 4 or 5 seconds of gray fog. Then I come out, and I was in this new vision. It was just blurry, and all of a sudden it clicked in. I could see I was on a city street. It was not today because there were horse-drawn carriages and gas lights. She says, when do you think it is? Now, I didn't know, but I assumed it was probably the middle, late 1800s. It was a sunny day. I could feel the sun beating down on me. Now, I'm in a closed office. She said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to meet a woman. She said, okay, so you meet her. Where do you go? I said, we went to a sidewalk cafe, and she ordered special water, and I ordered some wine. She says, now I want you to go 5 years forward. So again, there'd be 4 or 5 seconds of gray fog, and I'm in the hallway of an apartment building. I'm having an argument with this woman. I'm assuming she's my wife the way we were arguing. So I just walk away. I walk down the hallway, and I walk into a room, and it's an artist studio. There's the whole roof of skylights, and the wall to my right, the whole wall is the windows. There are just dozens and dozens of paintings hanging around. Then all of a sudden, like with the caveman, I knew who this person was. I could feel what this person was thinking and feel what he was feeling. I told her, I'm an artist. That's how I make my living. So we talked about that for a minute, and she said, now go 5 years in the future. So I went 5 years, and I got to the fog. I'm at some kind of party, and I'm the guest of honor. People just come over and shake my hand, congratulate me, and I could feel this person whose body this was in. This was one of the high moments of his life. Now, I had no idea what he had done or what he was celebrating about. But it was just a moment of intense happiness. Okay, now go 5 years in the future. But I just didn't want to. How many times in your life do you really experience just that kind of intense happiness? It was really a good feeling. So Dr. Griffin told me, now go 5 years. That's the interesting thing about hypnosis. You see these things on stage where they make you cluck like a chicken and stuff like that. That's not true. You're in hypnosis. You're still in control. You know what's going on around you. But anyway, finally I said, okay, so you look 5 years in the future. After the fog, I'm in a big garden, a gigantic garden. It went for acres and acres. I had no idea where I was, but I was in a garden. And then anyway, doctor said, okay, now I want you to go to your death. Okay, I'll go through the fog again. And all of a sudden, I see I'm laying on a bed and I'm dying. And she said, okay, what did you regret about this life? And I said, I regret we didn't have children because my wife couldn't have children. And so I see myself rising out of the body, and I go through the ceiling of this building. I can see it's nighttime. I'm in a huge city. There are lights to every horizon. The doctor said, okay, now go into the light. Look up and go into the light. But again, I didn't. I saw myself flying through some woods. And I could tell it looked like a kind of a cold, blustery fall night because the trees still had their leaves. So next thing I see, I'm on the second or third floor of this mansion, and I'm looking in the room. And there's a big fire in this fireplace. Nobody's in the room, but over the fireplace is a painting. And it's a still life. There's a bottle and fruit, a big sun. And I told Dr. Griffith, I wanted to see one of my paintings before I left this earth, left the world. I wanted to see my painting one more time. So finally she said, okay, now go into the light. She said, I want you to go to a life when you're a female. And I remember laughing to myself, saying, yeah, that's going to happen. So anyway, went 4 or 5 seconds of the fog, and sure enough, I'm standing in some woods again, but it's not the valley. And I look down, and I'm at my woman's body. Now I'm trying to think myself. The other stuff I thought, this is just old memories, Bob. You know, movies you've seen and TV programs. Now where in the hell could this have come from? I'm thinking, this is really strange. After a moment, I could think and feel what this person is feeling. I told Dr. Griffith, I belong here, that I work here. In front of me was a big circular monument, pillars in a circle, and there was an altar in the middle. I told Dr. Griffith that I work here. Me and the other girls, we bring things down to the altar. All the girls said, you had to be pretty, you had to be a virgin to work here. Dr. Griffith said, okay, go 5 years in the future. So I did again. When I come out of the fog, I'm in a cart being pulled by some oxen, and there's an old man sitting left to me. And to the right, there's a little girl who I know through this body I'm in. It's my daughter. So obviously, I wasn't a virgin any longer, and I obviously couldn't work at the altar any longer. But the interesting part was the little girl I recognized as a person from my present life. It was my stepdaughter, but she wasn't the age she was that day. She was a teenager in high school. This was the age she was when I married her mother. She's just a little girl. I told Dr. Griffith, this is my daughter, and since I couldn't work at the altar anymore, he gave me or sold me to this older man. We got to where he lived, his farm, and he died pretty soon afterwards. And so I saw myself take my daughter back to the altar, and I gave her to him. I kept telling Dr. Griffin, and kept trying to feel like I needed to justify it, that I was really doing the best thing in the world for her, that she'd be taken care of and be happy there and everything. I felt just some terrible shame, because what I was really doing was abandoning her there, because I knew it'd be a lot easier for me if I didn't have a little girl. You're a single woman. Back in old ancient times, you would be a lot better off without a little girl hanging on. And so I gave her to the altar.
When do you suppose, what point in time, this sounds like it could have been 1,000 years ago, or...
It was like Greek architecture. The altar had big, tall pillars in a circle, and the altar was in the middle of it.
During that lifetime, when you discovered you were a female, you had a female's body, was that the point of departure where you thought, this is not my memory, this is something else?
I thought this is just goofy. I thought maybe you're a little more susceptible to what the psychologist asked during hypnosis. But anyway, I felt this person was just filled with this terrible shame and guilt. What she'd done is she basically abandoned her daughter. So anyway, doctor said, okay, now go to your death. What happened? Well, apparently I'd moved to a town or village on the water, and I'd end up dying in a fishing accident. I could feel nets around my legs, and I was drowning. And for just a moment, I could taste salt water. But just for a moment, and I thought how bizarre that was. So anyway, Dr. Rivers said, okay, now, so I want you to go now to the life you lived before you were Bob Snow. Go to your very most previous past life. I was glad to get out of this life because I could still feel this terrible, terrible, oppressive guilt this person felt about abandoning her daughter. So I was in a hurry this time to go into the light. So I went into the light, and about another 4 or 5 seconds, I come out, and I realized I knew I was back in the artist's body. I'm in my studio, when I described earlier, but I'm painting a portrait. Interesting enough, it's a portrait of a hunchback woman. And I thought how bizarre that was. And I thought, where could this have come from? Where did this memory come from? The painting was just about done. I could see it. And again, the visions were so clear, I could see every brushstroke. I thought, why would they be painting a hunchback woman? I thought how really strange that was. So anyway, I described it all to Dr. Griffiths. She said, okay, go 5 years forward. So I went 5 years forward. I'm having this vigorous argument with someone about the lighting for my paintings. So we went to talk about that for a while. She said, okay, go 5 years again. So I went 5 years, and I'm in a small garden, and there's a house close by, and I hear piano music up in the house. And Dr. Griffiths says, where are you at? Do you know where you're at? And again, I didn't know I was going to say it, but I just blurted out, we're in France. I'm in France. And I had no idea why I said that. So anyway, I see myself walking in the house, and my wife is playing the piano with a lot of people standing around. So I described this for a while. Dr. said, okay, go 5 years forward. So again, I get the kind of gray-brown fog I'm in. But before the next scene come up, all of a sudden I said, she died of a blood clot. The doctor said she died of a blood clot. Now, I had no idea who I was talking about, and I felt this terrible grief and sadness that whoever this woman was obviously extremely important to this person. At that moment, before I went to the next scene, the recorder I'd brought along snapped off, and I opened my eyes, and the regression was over. So now I feel kind of foolish, because I had gone there with these ideas of how this wouldn't happen, how I was so strong, he wouldn't hypnotize me, it'd all be goofiness, and I was kind of flustered, and I didn't really know what to do. And Dr. Griffiths was asking me, did you see how this stuff relates to your present life and all these kind of things? I don't remember what. I mumbled something to her and got out of there. And I went and sat in my car for a while, and I'm trying to figure, where could this have come from? I didn't recognize any of these things as memories that I could recall. The other thing that really disturbed me more than anything was the clarity of it, how vividly clear everything was. It wasn't like imagination or even regular dreams that are all blurry. This was just as vivid as could be. I could see every detail. I could see every brushstroke. So I finally told myself, Bob, this is just hypnosis. You brought up some old memories and reordered them into stories. They're not real memories. They're just things you reordered. That's all it is. Just forget about it. Well, that's easy to say, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I would think about it 50, 60 times a day. For the first couple of years after the regression, if I closed my eyes, I could still see the scenes clear as can be.
You're still skeptical, though, even after the session.
Oh, yeah, I don't believe this is anything but just my subconscious mind responding to Dr. Griffith's instructions. I'm thinking up bits and pieces from my subconscious mind and reorder them into some kind of story for her.
Even the memory of you in a woman's body?
I remember Tom Hanks did a TV program where he was masquerading a woman. And I'm thinking, this is all this is. You've seen these movies or TV programs. I'm trying to find some logical explanation for all these things. But I just basically told myself, just forget about it, Bob. But I couldn't. And it started to worry me because I was a police officer for 38 years, and I've seen people who are obsessed with things. And very seldom does it turn out real good for you if you have a real bad obsession with something. So I told myself, Bobby, what you need to do, you need to find one of the two paintings, either Still Life or The Hunchback Woman. I said, you need to find the paintings, then you'll remember, oh yeah, I saw that at a exhibition somewhere. So I made a plan that I would go down to the public library and I would go through their art section until I found the paintings. It didn't turn out as well as I thought. The public library had hundreds of art books. And I went through every single one and didn't find the Still Life or didn't find the Hunchback Woman. Now I'm really confused. I can't figure it out. So I started going to bookstores, Barnes & Noble, B. Dalton, looking through art books. I didn't find anything. Didn't find either painting. I thought this won't be hard to solve. I'll see it, then I'll remember. So then I started calling art galleries around Indianapolis and asking them. Now this was pre-internet days. In those days, if you wanted a painting, you had to know where it was, who had it. Before the internet, there was no central listing of them anywhere. I wasn't ready to give up yet. So what I did, I went to a New Age store and bought a couple books on past life regression. I thought maybe if you read up on it, you could understand what happened. And I read the books, and I was surprised at how many people had very similar experiences to me. But there was also one book I had that had a script for self-hypnosis. I thought, well, I'll try that. I thought maybe I could go back and find something out. Believe me, that's a lot harder than you think. I probably did it a dozen times, and only twice I could feel myself going to the state I was in Dr. Griffith's office. But it would only last for just a couple seconds. I would go into it, I could see the number 1917, then it'd be like a balloon pop. So finally, I went back to Dr. Griffith for a second session. And I went over to hypnosis again. It was very similar to this experience, except every time she told me to go to the artist's life, nothing had happened. She wanted me to go back to it. Nothing happened. She said, well, apparently you know everything you need to know. There's no other avenue I can approach on this. So I said, just going to have to forget about it. But I didn't forget about it. A couple months later, of course, my wife and I's anniversary in April, and we thought we'd go somewhere neither of us had ever been. And so one day she called my office and said, what do you think about New Orleans? I thought, boy, that sounds like a good idea. So we went down to New Orleans. And we spent a week there, and my wife's a real history buff. So we visited the battlefield of 1812. We visited all kind of plantations and all that. And at nighttime, we go down to the French Quarter and, have some drinks, listen to the bands and all that. There were lots of neat stores in the French Quarter, memorabilia stores, antique stores, things like that. So on our last day in New Orleans, our plane didn't leave till the evening. So I told my wife, why don't we go window shopping in the French Quarter? We finally get down to the end of Royal Street, and there's a little small gallery at the end, and it's a two-story gallery. It said, modern art upstairs. My wife's a fan. I never have been a fan of modern art, but she is, so she went upstairs. I'm walking along the first floor. I'm looking at the paintings. I don't recognize any of the paintings. I'm walking along, and I get to the corner. There's a portrait on an easel, and I just glance at it, and then I stopped. I turn around. It was the portrait of the hunchback woman. Now, and I think, no. This doesn't happen. It happens on movies and TV. It doesn't happen in real life. So I told myself first, okay, Bob, this looks like, but it's not the painting. But I closed my eyes, and I could see the painting, and I could see it was exactly the same painting. So now I'm thinking, maybe I'm not here. Maybe I'm in a hospital or a nursing home with wires and tubes. These things do not happen to people. I was trying just desperately to think of some logical, rational explanation for this. How could this happen? And a salesman apparently sees me. And I told him, I don't recognize the artist. Who painted this? So he went to the desk and said the artist's name was J. Carroll Beckwith. He had a little short paragraph. And I suddenly saw 5 different confirmations of what I'd seen there. Number one, that there was a painting of Hunchback Woman. And that, interesting enough, Beckwith was born in 1852, and he died in 1917. And I remember my 2 self-hypnosis things of seeing the number 1917. And also, I found that he had lived during the late 19th century, which I told Dr. Griffith I thought that's when it was, when I was in the city. I also had found that he had spent some time in France. And I had told Dr. Griffith, she asked where we were at, I said we were in France. And also that he had won some awards for his painting during his life. And I remembered the party I was at. But again, these are little small things. That doesn't mean anything. But now I knew this case was going to be real open. I may have put it on the shelf, but now I had a name, and I had a birth date and death date. I knew there had to be a rational, logical explanation. And I would go back to Annapolis. I would remember where I ran into the paintings by Mr. Beckwith, and it would explain everything. So I go back to the public library. They had nothing on Beckwith. It turns out he was mainly a portrait painter during his time. He never painted any masterpiece that you'd recognize. I mean, he made most of his living painting portraits. He wasn't a great portrait painter. So anyway, the librarian told me, says, why don't you go up to the Art Museum library? They have a much more extensive library on artists than we do. So I went to their library, and the lady was able to find me some more information about Beckwith. But unfortunately, the information she got me kept confirming everything I'd seen in the regression. When I went to my death in the Beckwith life, I thought it was the fall of the year. Well, he died in October. I thought he was in a large city. Well, he died in New York City. It also said that he painted portraits but didn't like doing it. I remember telling Dr. Griffith, I don't like painting portraits, but I need the money. And he also said he was in need of money most of his life. And also said that his paintings were full of sun and bright color. And I remember the painting over the fireplace had a sun in it and it was bright color. But again, I'm telling myself, okay, Bob, so all this is lucky guesses. The librarian said, I have a pamphlet from an exhibition of Beckwith's work that was held here in Annapolis. At that moment, it felt like the greatest relief in the world. I thought, unfortunately, the exhibition had been in 1911. There's been none since. But anyway, I noticed on one of the little things she'd found me, a little reference, this information had come from the diaries of J. Carroll Beckwith that are on file at the National Academy of Design in New York City. I had already found 10 things that confirmed what I'd seen. Now, I'm still not accepting this as anything but just old memories in my mind. Maybe the diaries would explain how I knew some things about him. So I went to the library, and I asked for an interlibrary loan. I went home, and I listened to the tape again. I wrote down everything I had said about Beckwith that could be confirmed or denied. So anyway, 2 weeks later, they called me and said, your microfilm's here. I found out that Beckwith was a very avid diary keeper. He started at age 19 and made his last entry the night before he died. So I read them, and again, I kept finding the confirmation. For example, he actually attended art school in Paris for 5 years. He was roommates with John Singer Sargent, who was a very famous American painter. They were roommates in Paris for 5 years, went to art school. And again, it's another confirmation. And also, he talked about not having any children. He said him and his wife really would have loved children, but they didn't have any children. You keep finding these things, one after another after another. I don't know what to do. Now, so I thought, what I need to do, I need to get somebody else outside to look at this stuff. My wife was a detective also. She didn't know what I was doing. So I sat down and told her. She thought I was nuts. I said, well, now, wait a minute now. Look at everything I've gathered, and you tell me an explanation. So she looked at everything. She said, Bob, you just saw a movie about him or read a book about him a long time ago. That's all this is. This is not true. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll find that information that you forgot about.
At what point did you reach out to Walter Semke, reincarnationresearch.com? What gave the idea to do that?
That was long after I wrote the book. That was long afterwards. Yeah, well, what happened, my wife said, shut up about it. Police captains don't talk about this. Just shut up. And I agreed with her. So I sent the tapes back. But then I ran into some officers who told me some stories about paranormal experiences police officers had found. I figured, hey, if they can talk about it, I can. I ordered the tapes again, and I read every single page of the diary, looking for the one denying thing, the one thing that would say, well, this isn't true. But I didn't. I kept finding one point after another point after another point. What really turned me was I got to December 5th, 1886. I knew there was only 2 women in Beckwith's life were important to him, his wife and his mother. His mother more than anybody because she's the only one in his family encouraged him to be an artist. On December 5th, 1886, his mother was in church, and she died from a stroke caused by a blood clot. I think that was the one that pushed me over. I told you I'd found 28 facts. I ended up proving all 28. Didn't find one single thing I'd seen that wasn't true about Beckwith. You can guess a lot of things about a person's life. You're not going to guess what his mother died of. It's not possible. You can make maybe a half dozen or a dozen lucky guesses. You cannot make 28 correct guesses about a person without those being real memories.
Speaking of real memories, you also mentioned in the book that the perception of the past life events were actually more clear than waking consciousness.
It was just amazing if you have a vision. It's like dreams are always kind of blurry and, imagination kind of blurry. This was not. This was clear. And not only could I see and hear things, I could taste the salt water. I could smell the cave. I thought that was just part of the hypnosis, but I thought that was kind of remarkable. It was so vivid. And that's what really disturbed me about the things, and not the fact what I saw, but how vividly clear it all was. Finding this thing and realizing, yes, these are true memories of J. Carroll Beckwith. These are memories I carry in my mind of him. That's not the hard part. I can accept what I found. The hard part is thinking, how does that affect my life? Everything I had thought, all my belief system was wrong. The world didn't work the way I thought it did, and all the people I thought were goofy people were right. I was wrong, and they were right. That was the hardest part to accept. You have to change your whole belief system of how the world and the universe operates.
You're definitely not alone, because I've heard that quite a few times. It does turn your world upside down in some cases. This type of thing really runs counter to what a lot of us were brought up to believe. You basically verified 28 different facts about Carroll Beckwith.
20, yes.
28. And you didn't strike out on one. You nailed every single one of them.
Not a single one, no. If I had a homicide case that had this much proof, it'd be a slam dunk. You don't have this kind of evidence in a murder case. Every single thing I saw proved to be true.
When you and the wife went to New Orleans and you happened to stumble onto a gallery that had the painting of the Hunchback Woman, there are those of us who might think that there is some kind of spirit guidance it wasn't a coincidence. I know what your feelings were then, but what are your feelings about that now?
That's kind of a scary thought, because you realize that it'd take a higher power to do this. That scared me for a while, just because the odds of that thing happening are just millions and millions to one. The odds of just accidentally stumbling onto a pain you saw in the regression. Come on, that'd be hard to believe it was just a coincidence. It really would. It wasn't the only time in this investigation that I had information I could dump in my lap. I had several times where information I was trying to find about Beckwith, I couldn't find, was suddenly just dumped in my lap. For example, in his diary, he talks a number of times about working on his scrapbooks, and I couldn't find out where they were. And I was talking to an expert on American art, and we were just talking. All of a sudden, she said, don't you, his scrapbooks at the New York Historical Society? Just out of the blue. I hadn't asked about him or anything. This is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because this really did some real serious damage to my career at the police department. I had warnings from my wife. I had warnings from my agent that this could damage my writing career also. But I still felt it had to be done. It simply had to be published. There's too much of a push from somewhere to get this done.
It's almost as if whatever you want to call it, source or the divine, basically used you as an example. An interesting parallel to that, speaking of near-death experiences, which you mentioned briefly, there have been several neurosurgeons who are atheists who've written books about that. And I can't help but get the feeling they are actually chosen to be an example because they were skeptics, like you were. If
I had to do the whole thing over again, I would do it, even though it took me 6 years after I wrote this book before I could get a book published. My agent told me, he said, Bob, if you publish the book, publishers are not going to take you serious as a factual police procedural writer. And she was right. It took me 6 years. But like anything, time passes, people forget. The police department wasn't as nice. I was in homicide, and I was very successful. The murder rate was down, clearances were up. They moved me out and put me in a place, it's called Central Desk. It's a place where people come to get police records or get fingerprinted. It's a place they put captains if they're planning on retiring. That was supposed to be the message I was supposed to get, is that you're done here. But again, I would do it again. It was just too important a message not to publish.
Your case is featured on the reincarnationresearch.com website, which is run by Walter Semke. Yeah. Very interesting man. I know that you've had some discussions with him. What were his thoughts on your case?
Walter and I are old friends. Walter and I have done a number of presentations together. Walter has a different take on reincarnation. He believes that you bring certain physical characteristics from one life to another. That's my problem with this whole thing, is people have always asked me, what does this mean? What is the significance of this? I'm a police officer. My job was investigation. I'm not a theologian or philosopher, and I really can't answer these questions.
Okay, that's fair. But after your experience, you've pretty much accepted it that it's not a hoax. It's not your imagination, that these were past lives.
There's absolutely no other explanation.
Right.
There simply isn't.
I will mention this about Walter, because what he did, he took the work of Ian Stevenson, basically put those accounts into story form so people can actually read them. Stevenson wrote for the academics. He wrote a book on birthmarks in reincarnation cases. It was 2,000 pages long. Anyone who's familiar with Ian Stevenson's work knows that he validated about 1,500 cases of children with past life memories. This goes all the way back to the 60s.
Stevenson, basically, a lot of countries where this is part of their belief system. If you're Buddhist or Hindu, it happens a lot in Western civilization, too, that a little kid will say something that sounds like a past life, but parents just brush it off. Whereas in other countries where it's for part of your belief system, they take it much more serious. And that's why Stevenson's able to find a lot of accounts.
Right.
But again, like you said, he was a professor at the University of Virginia. I read his books. It's very academic, very dry academic stuff. Yes, it is. He wasn't trying to be a popular writer.
Yeah, he would not be trying to sell books on Amazon. I know that. I just thought it's interesting that I found your case on Walter's website, because I really got a kick out of interviewing him and talking about this whole thing and what he did with Stevenson's work. What would your advice be to someone who has had memories like you did, and maybe they did a past life regression and they still didn't know what to think? What would you tell them?
You can investigate them. Anybody can do it, but you got to have a lot of patience. And you had to have a lot of facts. I had an idea for a book. I thought I might do a book investigating other people's regressions. But I found a lot of the regressions, there was not a lot of facts to it. I had one that was really kind of interesting about a brother and sister who were at a lake, and the sister fell in, was drowning, and the brother jumped in to save her, and he drowned too. But there was no location, no time, no date. And so there was just basically nothing to really investigate. Unless you had a place or a time, you probably could have found an account of this. But that problem is, in multiple regression, you don't have the dates and times and facts. I was very fortunate in mine that I was able to find all these things, be able to record them, and I made my own tape and be able to prove them. Now, people might ask, if he was an unimportant, mediocre painter, why would they save his diary? There's a really good reason. Beckwith was a social butterfly. He knew everybody. He was friends with Theodore Roosevelt. Him and Mark Twain owned summer homes together up in the Catskills. He knew Mark Twain. When Oscar Wilde came to America, he stayed with Beckwith. He stayed in Beckwith's apartment. He knew Claude Monet. He knew everybody. And so his diary is full of little tidbits of interactions with these people.
Really interesting. That I did not know about Beckwith. Speaking of which, you visited his grave. There's a picture of you literally standing over his grave. What did that feel like?
When I was writing the book, I went to New York. I wanted to see if I could find any of the places Beckwith had been. This is where his studio was and various things he mentioned about New York. Well, everything's gone. He died in 1917. And so during that time, everything's been demolished. And actually, he died. He was walking in Central Park and had a heart attack. He managed to get to a cab and get back to his apartment where he was living, and he died in his wife's arms. The building's no longer there. There's a little park there. He was buried at Kensico Cemetery, which is in Valhalla, New York, a suburb of New York City. So while I was in New York doing my research, trying to find it, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to visit your own grave? How many people get a chance in their life to visit your own grave? So I took a train up to Valhalla, and I went to the office at the cemetery. It's a beautiful cemetery. It had a lot of famous people buried there. If you were anybody of money of importance in New York City, you got buried at Kensico Cemetery. But anyway, they drew me a map how to get to Beckwith's grave. So when I got within maybe 10 feet of his grave, I started having a panic attack. Now, when I was first coming to the police department as a new officer, you had run into a lot of scary situations, and I'd often have panic attacks. You'd feel your heart beating, you start sweating, you feel electricity in your hands, and always my left knee would shake. And I felt the same thing. I'm approaching the grave. And I'm telling myself at the time, Bob, this is silly. There can't be any spirit or any ghost. That spirit was in him, is in you. So there's nothing in this grave. There's nothing. And I kept telling myself that. This is silly. But I could not stop it. I had a terrible panic attack. So anyway, there's some workmen working on some hedges about 100 feet away. So I walked over to them, and funny, once I left the grave, once I got about 10 feet of the grave, and I wanted to get my picture taken. I wanted to prove I wasn't scared. So I went back to the grave to have them take my picture, and again, the minute I got within about 10 feet of the grave, I got this terrible panic attack again. And it continued till the guy took the picture and I could get out of there. Now, I have no idea what this means, but apparently you're not supposed to do this. And different people trying to explain why that would happen. I don't know. Can't figure out why would I have that kind of reaction to visiting the grave.
You were told that one should not visit the body of someone that you had occupied at one point.
I have no idea why, but apparently you're not supposed to do this. Once I left the grave, it was fine.
I've never heard that, but I'm not going to doubt it. I'll make a mental note if that ever happens to me, and listeners, I recommend you do the same. Bob, excellent info. Thanks for coming on to the show today. How can our listeners learn more about you online?
I've written 20 books, and they're all on Amazon. I have an author's page on Amazon, and it also has all my books.
Okay, we'll definitely put that in the show notes and the transcript as well. You've been listening to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing. You can also leave us a review on iTunes as well. For more info, go to closertovenus.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.